Names continue to surface for New Orleans Saints potential interviews and head coaches. Some of them are being reported, then they're refuted, but we're getting a reasonable list of some of the guys that are on this list to this point. There is a report from Jonathan Jones of NFL on CBS. The Saints have scheduled an interview with Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver for today, Wednesday. We know that New York Giants offensive coordinator and assistant head coach Mike Kafka is scheduled to interview on Friday. Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator of the Lions, expected sometime between Thursday and Saturday, as the Lions will have a bye this week, so they've got a little bit of time on their hands. And I'm not going to necessarily dive deep into all of these candidates and their entire backgrounds. We can do that as we feel like it gets narrowed down. There are absolutely 10 names that have surfaced as possibilities for the Saints at this point. So for me to sit here and go through the background of 20 years of 10 guys and go through 200 years of coaching is not necessarily a necessity at this point. But I'm interested at some of these names and kind of the background the Saints are looking for. Because if you look at Anthony Weaver, that's a guy who feels like, as a defensive-minded coach, is a culture builder. That's kind of his reputation in the NFL. Relates very well to players, kind of runs a CEO-type deal. The Lions are not built on their defense at this point. That's an offensive football team at this point. But he's a guy that's thought of as a culture builder. Mike Kafka is a guy who his background is really based in Andy Reid. That's a guy who Andy Reid pegged out of college as a guy he wanted to play for him. He did play for him in Philadelphia. Then he stopped playing football, was a grad assistant at Northwestern, and then joined Andy Reid's staff for a little bit at Kansas City, where he's working with Reid and Mahomes. And so the intrigue is that he spent some time under one of the greatest coaches of this generation. You look at Aaron Glenn, that's a guy with ties to the Saints. That's a guy who is a defensive-minded coach, but also a guy that is thought of as a really great communicator with players. And I started to look at some of the backgrounds of some of the best coaches in the NFL currently. And there's a good mix between guys who you think of as just kind of CEOs. I'm here to run it. It's not necessarily my scheme that we're running. I'm going to bring in coordinators to do that, but I'm going to run this organization. I'm going to communicate. I've got connections throughout the league. I'm going to make sure our staff is good. I'm going to make sure our scouting department is good. I'm going to make sure that everything is running the way that it should, and I'll lead the team on Sundays while the coaches on the side, either side of the ball handle the coaching. Guys like Dan Campbell, who's a tight ends coach. He's a culture guy. John Harbaugh was a special teams coach. He's a culture guy. Been incredible in the league. Mike Tomlin was a defensive coordinator for one season in the NFL. That's a guy who's built an incredible culture, and they've used different offensive coordinators. Now, a lot of it was with Ben Roethlisberger, but a lot of different offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators have come and gone, but he's kind of held it together. That's the culture guys in the NFL. That's a little bit harder to find, but really good when it works. A little bit harder to find than the scheme guys. You look at Kyle Shanahan. That's a scheme guy. You know, as long as he's the head coach, you're going to cycle through quarterback coaches and offensive coordinators, but he's going to be the guy that's putting in the offense, and he'll just kind of keep plugging it along, and you got to make sure that the guys up top with John Lynch and company are restocking the shelves, but he's going to run that scheme. Sean McVay is the same way in Los Angeles. That's a scheme guy on offense. Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota, who's had a great year this year, that's a scheme guy on offense. Andy Reid is a scheme guy. That's his offense. It was his offense in Philly. It's his offense in Cincinnati. Matt LaFleur is the same way. Sean Payton's the same way. Bill Belichick was the same way on the defensive side of the ball. That can also happen. Rex Ryan was a defense guy when he was having success with the Jets. There are two different ways to kind of look at this. And as I was evaluating these candidates, and I'm not ready, as I just said, to like completely go all in on going through the entire background of every single coach that gets mentioned. But I think, in a position, and I say that because I don't think the Saints are going to hire a coach for 2 weeks. So as I say that, I want to kind of get a picture of what are the characteristics. And I know that if you've listened to some of the shows here, like Matt on AFR, will tell you, I want a young offensive guy. You had the old defensive guy. Give me the young offensive guy. You know who's a young offensive guy? Sean Payton. Like that's kind of what he's looking at. And I went through that list there, and Kyle Shanahan was a young offensive guy, and Sean McVay was a young offensive guy. So was Kevin O'Connell and Matt LaFleur. They were all young offensive guys. But there are defensive guys as well. And I think that Aaron Glenn would fit that mold. But I'm looking at what characteristics am I looking at? And I keep going back to the fact that I think the scheme is the most important thing to me. It's a constant. I realize there are two different worlds, but you knew what Nick Saban's defense was going to do. You know what Kirby Smart's defense is going to do. You knew what Steve Spurrier's offense was going to do. You knew what Urban Meyer's offense was going to do. And that's college football's a different world. But we talk about both here, and I rattled through a lot of the offensive guys on this list too. And I think if you can always have that scheme, and then you can find that quarterback, I think that's where it pops. And I think it's the easiest way to the top. Look, myself very, very much included, I made fun of the Dan Campbell hire because of the press conference. I will hold my hand up on that till the day I put up the microphone, because that was a ridiculous press conference. But his guys bought into it, and more importantly than the players buying in, which they have to buy in. You lose the locker room, you're toast. But you can have a lot of player buy-in. If your scheme stinks, you're toast. He went and got Ben Johnson, and Aaron Glenn's done a really good job too. And that's the key. And I don't know, because Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn are going to take head coaching jobs, I feel pretty confident, this year. So what does Dan Campbell do then? Is it as good? I don't know, because I don't have a constant. I would give him a good chance. He's been in the league a long time. He's now built a culture that attracts young coaches, and maybe you give him a pretty good opportunity to go get the next great pair of coordinators. It could happen. Nick Saban hired a ton of good offensive coordinators, and that wasn't really his side of the ball. Different sport, I know. Different league. But as I look at this with the Saints, I'm starting to think that I want the guy with the scheme. Like, I don't need Darren Rizzi, sorry. Did a great job infusing some life into that locker room for 2 weeks. And there's absolutely value in that. But it makes me nervous. And in this market, even if you're just a Saints fan who's not tied directly to LSU, and you're listening to this or you're checking us out on YouTube, and you don't care about LSU, but LSU hired Ed Ogeron. That's a culture guy. And man, did he go restock the shelves, and man, did he keep Dave Aranda, and did he get Joe Brady, and they made it. I mean, it was beautiful. And then Steve Ensminger quit, and Joe Brady left, and Dave Aranda took a head coaching job, and it cratered. It doesn't matter why. It just matters that it did. And as I look at the Saints, I want that scheme to be attached to it. So you got to give me a guy with a lot of experience as a defensive coordinator who's going to bring that in. That was Dennis Allen. Didn't work. Or give me a guy on the offensive side of the ball. There seem to be more of those in the mix here. And I mentioned yesterday that Todd Monken would be my pick as a guy who's actually been a head coach and had the scheme. But I feel like as I look around the league, you look at the most successful coaches, I think more often than not, they come with a scheme background. And that's where I would go if I were the New Orleans Saints. There's more Saints news today that we want to get to, and it's disappointing news for sure, certainly not unexpected news. The news that Ryan Ramczyk's retirement papers will be filed with the NFL, and his playing career will come to an end. That's not surprising news. We kind of felt that way as you looked at this situation last spring. You got the sense from talking to folks that cover the team day to day that Ryan Ramczyk's career was probably done. You found out in training camp that he was not going to be a part of this Saints team. And so I think the most important thing we do here is just talk about the incredible career that Ryan Ramczyk enjoyed in New Orleans. We have talked a ton about how vital the draft is going to be for the New Orleans Saints in the next couple of years. You have got to hit on guys in the draft early and often. And the Saints took Ryan Ramczyk in the 2017 draft out of Wisconsin. And this dude was one of the premier right tackles in the game of football for a handful of years. He was a first-team All-Pro in 2019. He was a second-team All-Pro in 18 and 20. He and Lane Johnson were kind of the top two guys in the sport. And unfortunately, at a position where you do see guys excel in their early 30s, which you don't see a ton of that at running back. Sometimes you kind of run out of steam at corner at that age. But tackles and guards can play, and centers can play into their early 30s, and Ryan Ramczyk's only 30 years old, and his career appears to be done due to those knee injuries, but a really, really great Saint and a huge hit in the draft for New Orleans. These are the kind of guys they have got to find a way to land and get younger and cheaper. And as I mentioned, younger and cheaper, Ryan Ramczyk moves on, so does his money. There is still going to be a cap hit here, but Ramczyk is going to reduce his 2024 base salary from $18 million to the league minimum, which is $1.255 million, and that creates about $16.7 million in cap space for the Saints in 2025. You've still got a long way to go. You've still got $50+ million that you've got to move around for New Orleans and whoever this new head coach is going to be. But the fact is that you're moving in the right direction there because of Ramczyk. Would the new coach rather have a second-team All-Pro right tackle making a good chunk of change? Yeah, at 30 years old, probably would prefer that as opposed to him moving on. But Ryan Ramczyk not going to be able to play, so he will free up a little bit of room. There are going to be some more moves that are made to chip away at the deficit. This is very, very much commonplace for New Orleans. It's complicated, and it's not something I'm going to proclaim to be completely proficient in, but I do understand that they get through these gymnastics each and every year. And I will say this. Nothing that they did outside of Kamara, which I disagreed with at the time and still do today, nothing that they did outside of Kamara in last offseason has significantly hampered them moving forward, and now you clean up a little bit more room with Ramczyk moving on. Derek Carr is still the biggest piece here, and that's either going to be a huge chunk of your salary cap in 2025 because he's on the team or because it's dead money, but that's a huge domino that's going to fall here eventually. But Ramczyk's finally did fall today, according to reports. They'll clear that $16.7 million, 50 more to clean up. They'll do some restructuring, but I'm hopeful that this is all part of a new leaf that they're turning over as far as the money goes. And every indication outside of Kamara has been that that's the case. So very, very disappointed that Ryan Ramczyk has moved on, but it's just part of football. There's just nothing you can do about those chronic injuries, and he tried to gut it out in the 2023 season and tried to play through it the best he could, but there was a lot of pain. He just wasn't the player that we had grown accustomed to seeing in New Orleans. So a great Saint, a great draft pick, a symbol of what they need more of moving forward, and then a little relief on the salary cap side of things as you move into 2025 and look for a new team. He'll go into retirement as one of the better draft picks of the last decade for New Orleans. Didn't get as much out of him as maybe you hoped, but great player for the Saints. Hey, it's Hunt. Thanks for watching Hunt on Saints. Before you leave, help us out a little bit. Hit that like button, leave your comments in the section below, and hit that subscribe button so you get all our content right here from Hunt on Saints. We'll see you next time.